the Institute for the Study of Peak States presents the second International Psychoimmunology and Psychobiology Research Symposium. A mother's journey through the research process for potential treatment for autism, by Shane Mackenzie interviewing Sonia Walcott.
Hello.
So just before I start asking you some questions to be able to share, let me just spend a few minutes just giving the audience a bit of context around a bit of history on our autism research. Okay, so we've been researching autism for over 20 years. It started because one of our staff, his son had autism. And, quite often that's how our research starts, with some kind of personal interest, someone that we really care about deeply is impacted by that. And so researched that for quite a while. Then in 2000, had a first process kind of ready for some testing. So the process is done with the mothers. So obviously a child with autism is going to have some challenges around doing trauma healing technique. And 4 of the 5 children in that first kind of testing were all successful. Their symptoms disappeared. And probably one of the most interesting things to see was that obviously one of the key criteria for autism is the developmental delay. And so after the treatment, they very quickly went through a catch up in development, and all of the children then began to talk. So they go through a crawling and sucking thumb and all of the earlier stages that they hadn't necessarily gone through, and very rapidly, usually within a few months, but certainly within a year, they were kind of back up to their physical age from a development perspective. So that was pretty amazing. The one child where it wasn't successful, the mother didn't continue with the treatment, so she pulled out partway through. So one of the challenges here, so while this is in the early stages of research, is around understanding the biology and then getting a treatment that's effective. But in the early stages, quite often it's complicated or challenging. And so one of the things we then needed to go away was to think about how do we actually make this kind of easier to do. So about 8 years later, modified that process again. Only this time, so we had about 10 children in this study, and this time we actually didn't get positive results. And there was a few things that were interesting out of this. One, while these children have been diagnosed with autism, from our perspective on what we think is the biological root cause of this, I think the research team's view was probably only 3 of them really had autism. A few others had other things that might have been Asperger's or traumatic brain injury or something like that. 2 of them, the research team didn't really find, from our model perspective, really anything wrong with them all. I think one of the mothers actually said, they thought they had autism because they argued with their brother all the time. So there really was a challenge around what was actually being diagnosed from this perspective. And given we noticed that there were a variety of reasons, one of the things we tested was whether brain damage was actually one of the things that was causing autism. So we came up with an effective treatment for addressing brain damage, but it didn't actually make a difference to autism. Then a few years later again, we came up with an effective treatment for Asperger syndrome. Now, I know that in many countries, the Asperger syndrome is now included in the autism spectrum disorder. From our perspective, they're completely different biology and therefore require a different treatment. So we've had a successful treatment for Asperger's for a long time, but we're still researching one for autism. And then it was about 5 or 6 years ago, we identified a key developmental event for autism, and our current research process is based around that. In 2018, we developed a research process. So we've had a few people involved in that. Sonia's been one of the ones testing that. And at the moment it's appearing effective, but there's more efficacy testing that we want to do. So that's a little bit of background. So now, Sonia, some questions for you. So let's just start with, how old was your daughter when she was diagnosed with autism?
She was 4.5, maybe.
Mm-hmm. And what were you noticing about her behaviour that had you get diagnosed?
Honestly, it wasn't me. I she wasn't talking, but then my oldest daughter didn't start talking till she was about 2.5. So for me, Cynthia was just Cynthia. It was her daycare teacher who flagged it for me. She said that she believed that Cynthia had autism. Right up to that point, I was under the impression that, her father and I had gone through a separation and she was just withdrawn. She was very quiet. She didn't like mingling with other kids. But like I said, I just saw that as maybe trauma after the separation kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing.
And so then what led to getting a diagnosis for autism?
Oh, well, after that talk with the daycare teacher, I took her to what they called DADAC at the time, which is, I guess, the Australian government's version of Aspect. And she was diagnosed by two psychologists who basically said that she was on the high end of the spectrum, that she had no imagination, that um, she was quite underdeveloped. At the time, they said that she had the mental capacity of an 18-month-old child, etc., etc. So it was just, whoa.
Yeah, it must have been hard.
Yeah, yes,
And
it was.
so once you got that diagnosis, what kind of things did you try to do to help support her?
Um, well, at the time, see, I dug my heels in and I thought, nah, this can't be autism. My child is perfect. I came across information about a company called the Institute for the Development of Human Potential. So I started teaching her to read, and it was quite interesting that they have an entire book on what to do with your brain damaged child. So I started doing physical therapy with her. I started teaching her to read, and it was amazing because she could read, but she couldn't talk. She could not put a sentence together that made sense. And gosh, yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, seriously, my life became about her physical progression and her mental progression, and with fingers crossed all the time.
Yeah. And so it was in May 2009 that we got
Yes.
introduced through a mutual
Yes.
friend.
Hmm.
And so what do you recall from that time around evaluating whether to participate in a research process?
Well, to tell you the truth, when our mutual friend called, I was actually quite angry. I felt she was judged. It took me 2 days to be willing to contact her to get your details. But look, at the time, I was willing to give anything a go. I mean, there was always this fear in the background that, oh my God, what if she gets worse?
Mm,
Because, we would go to a shopping center and she would walk around like the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and she would watch the same movie for 12 straight hours, spinning on the spot. So it was, anything could be an improvement on that.
yeah.
But by then she was about, what, 6 or 7?
Hmm.
Actually, that was in '09. So sorry, she would have been about 8.
Right.
She had just recently been potty trained, so it was a really hard slog by then.
Okay. And so it's been a long journey, so nearly 12 years. What were some of the challenges of participating in the research?
Well, I think the worst of it was the emotional impacts. You see, we would go through a process and it was phenomenal. You know, Cynthia's whole demeanor would change. Her eyes would sparkle. She would be alive. She would just come out of herself. And then, you know, within a week, there would be this downturn. But let me digress. The first few sessions that I did with Nemi, who's the head of the Australian um, Australian what branch of
Clinic. Yep.
ISPS? Yeah,
Yep.
thank you. Um, all her repetitive symptoms disappeared, and that was a huge gain for me. I think within hours of that first day, Cynthia made her first sentence, which actually made sense. She walked up to her sister, hugged her, and said, "I love you, Sawa." You know, that was the first time in 8 years that she had ever said anything that was meaningful. She earlier that morning, she had been kicking this rock up and down this path for about 3-4 straight hours, and that stopped completely. So you know, that those first 3 days were like the awakening. Oh, you know, something good is happening. Um, but she was still unwilling to make friends. She was still withdrawn, whilst the repetitive behaviors had stopped. Yeah, I guess, you know, I expected we would go through this treatment and whoopee, you know, it would be this outgoing 8-year-old, you know, who would argue with mom, but that wasn't the case. So yeah, I think the emotional impacts, you know, the ups and downs of hopes and not so much hope, etc., etc.
So it was definitely a roller coaster. So you did share some of the highlights. Are there any other highlights you want to share around going through the research process?
Um, Gosh, for Cynthia, I think it gave her an opportunity that she would not otherwise have had, because at the time that we started the research, she was in a school called Clark Road for Specific Purposes, which is for severely brain damaged children. It's almost like a daycare center um, for for brain damaged children. And the biggest highlight was within about 6 months of going through the treatment, I was able to withdraw her from the school against the better judgment of her school principal, etc., etc. And she started going to a normal school in a multi-category class. And, you know, she started to acquire friendships. You know, her sense of humor started coming out. She started developing her likes. I mean, she just finished she just got her certificate for from TAFE in hospitality. You know, it's being out there with other people. She's an amazing artist. You know, which otherwise I would have never get gotten to get to see. For me, it's shown that, oh man, I can be really dogged and not give up. So um, and also seeing the dedication that this team has had over the last 12 years. The fact that they haven't given up, I mean, it's given me faith in the human race. But I can talk about the highlights forever. She's how much time have we got?
Okay, so let's talk about. So the part of the roller coaster was there would be some successes and then some
Yes.
regression. So it wasn't always stable.
No.
We eventually got to a point where it was successful and stable. Were there adjustments that you had to make when that was the case?
The adjustments were honestly just always for me. It was never for Cynthia, because basically I expanded my life to make sure that whatever was happening was going to be okay for her. But but if you're talking about her day-to-day living, no, not at all. I wasn't willing to buy into the this is autism and give her up kind of thing conversation. So I'm unless I misunderstood the question.
But no, it's sometimes because you had basically, as just about any mother would, adjust your life to make sure that that Cynthia was getting the support that she needed. Once she started to get better, did you have to adjust? And you've said that Cynthia didn't have to adjust anyway, but you had to make some adjustments to that, or not?
Um, well, sorry, that's a really difficult question. I had to give up being so protective of her. You know, the willingness to let her do, I mean, get on public transport by herself. It was like, you know, she's really effective at it. You know, the willingness to let her grow and develop, because right up to that point I was just always protective of her. When she was younger, she used to be ridiculed, so I I sort of was always hovering, and you know, the biggest adjustment was giving up control, absolute control. Took a lot of tapping.
So was she diagnosed again to test whether she would have been considered to still have autism?
Well, in order for me to get her out of Clark Road, her school principal in 2009 was after we went to meet with him, with Nemi and her team, and we came back to Sydney, and I went to see him and requested that she be moved out of the school. He absolutely refused. I didn't matter what I said. So in early 2010, a new school principal stepped in, and basically her thing was that she must be diagnosed again in order for her to be willing to let her move. So we went to Aspect, and Aspect's diagnosis at the time was that she was either not on the autistic border, or if she was, it was on the very low side of it, even though she had developmental delays. And throughout her schooling years, because Cynthia finished high school 2 years ago, they always had a school psychologist, and his feedback was always that he didn't feel that Cynthia was autistic, even though she could get help with the developmental stages of life. The truth of it is that, you know, whilst the treatment has been effective, it wasn't like she woke up one morning and she had suddenly caught up on whatever, how many years of development that she had missed. So it's been a progressive realization of all the developmental years.
Okay. So what would you want to say to anyone considering participating in any of our research projects, not just autism, given
Sure.
you've been on this journey for 12 years?
Yeah. Have faith. Honestly, that's all I can say. It's not going to be easy, but the results can absolutely amaze you if you're willing to give it a go.
Okay. And what would you say to someone who's been diagnosed with autism, or a parent who has a child with autism, as far as potentially participating in applied research in the process we have at the moment?
Guys, it's not going to be easy, but it's definitely worth it. I think that would be my message.
Radio, short and sharp, that's good. And what do you now personally want to do now that you've had this experience?
Well, I became a certified therapist a year ago, and the future that I'm creating is being part of the research and development for autism and making a difference, because one's life completely alters. Having an autistic child, or I guess any kind of anomaly in a child can be heartbreaking for a parent, and it can have huge strains on relationships. So I just personally, I want to give my life to making a difference to those families, being
Oh,
at the receiving end of it.
look forward to continuing the journey with you. And so,
Thanks.
is there anything else that you want to say to anyone else who's listening today?
Thanks, guys, for never giving up. Poor Grant. I'm sure I drove him crazy over the years, just messaging him, emailing him, when is the next process coming? But you know, and
Well,
also Nemi, thanks, guys.
okay. Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your dedication. 12 years getting to this point has definitely been a long journey, and we really appreciate everything you've done to contribute to our autism research.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sonia. Let's see if we've got any questions. Okay, so I just got a question around when do we think we'll have a release process. So we definitely want to do some more research. So we'll be hopefully fairly soon we'll be asking for more research clients to do some more applied research. So basically testing the same process that Sonia's gone through to assist with Cynthia. And so we will be posting that on our websites and newsletters and Facebook pages for when we're actually looking for more research clients. And with any luck, if that goes well, but you never know with research, but I'm, as the clinic director, I'm very hopeful that by the end of the year, we might have a process. So fingers crossed.
Thank you for watching. For more information, visit pigstates.com/autism.html.